Britain just got its seventh prime minister in a decade, and the outgoing one hadn't even finished his resignation speech before the President of the United States was already weighing in on Truth Social. 11,000 sailors have been stuck on ships in the Persian Gulf for almost 4 months, and they're only now being allowed to go home, quietly, with almost no coverage, while financial news spent the week obsessing over a stock market wobble. And Cristiano Ronaldo, at 41 years old, just did something no man has ever done in the history of the World Cup.
3 days after Lionel Messi did something almost as remarkable.
Let's get into all three. Start with London, because what happened to Keir Starmer this week is a story about how thin the margin for political survival has become in modern democracies, and about a foreign head of state who couldn't even let the moment breathe before turning it into commentary on his own scoreboard. Keir Starmer announced Monday that he's resigning as leader of the Labour Party, and therefore as Prime Minister, after barely 2 years in the job he won in a landslide. The proximate trigger was almost absurdly small in isolation. Andy Burnham, the long-serving mayor of Greater Manchester, known as the King of the North for his advocacy on behalf of England outside London, stepped down from that post last week specifically to contest and win a single by-election seat in Parliament. That's it. That's the move that broke the dam, because British prime ministers are conventionally chosen from sitting members of Parliament. Burnham getting elected to the Commons instantly made him eligible to challenge for the leadership, and within 72 hours, enough of Starmer's own cabinet and backbenchers had concluded his time was up, that he had no real path to survive a contest. Starmer had vowed all weekend that he would fight. He stood outside number 10, his voice audibly catching, and said, "The question my party is asking now is whether I am best placed to lead us into the next general election. I have heard the answer of my parliamentary party to that question, and I accept that answer with good grace." The deeper story here isn't really about Burnham's tactical brilliance. It's about how little runway any Western Democratic leader has right now when the public mood turns. Starmer won a landslide national election less than 2 years ago. By early May, in local council elections across England, Wales, and Scotland, his party hemorrhaged more than 1,000 council seats and lost its 27-year grip on the Welsh legislature outright. The party that benefited most wasn't Labour's traditional centre-right rival, it was Reform UK, the populist anti-immigration party led by Nigel Farage, who is explicitly aligned with Trump's politics and picked up nearly 1,300 council seats in a single round of voting. That's the real headline underneath Starmer's resignation. A center-left government elected with an enormous mandate lost public confidence almost entirely over 2 issues, immigration and energy costs, in under 2 years. And the beneficiary of that collapse was the populist right, not a moderate alternative. And then there's Trump's role in all of it, which deserves to be named directly, because of how revealing it is. As reports of Starmer's likely resignation spread over the weekend, before any official announcement, before Starmer himself had confirmed anything, Trump posted on Truth Social that the Prime Minister had failed badly on 2 very important subjects, immigration and energy, and added, with the kind of detached cruelty that's become his signature with foreign leaders he's deemed insufficiently aligned, "I wish him well." Think about the diplomatic norm being broken there. This is the President of the United States, publicly grading the job performance of America's closest ally's elected head of government, while that government is mid-collapse, before the man has even formally resigned. Whatever you think of Starmer's record, and the local election results suggest plenty of British voters had real grievances, there's a basic convention in international relations against actively piling onto an ally's domestic political crisis in real time, especially with a tone that reads less like statesmanship and more like a sports commentator mocking a losing coach. Burnham, who's now the overwhelming favorite to become prime minister within weeks, has previously warned explicitly against Britain adopting American-style politics. He may discover very quickly that he doesn't get to opt out of dealing with American-style politics even if he wants to, because the American president has already shown he'll insert himself into the British leadership conversation whether invited to or not. That's one kind of crisis resolving in public. with cameras and speeches. The next story is one that's been resolving almost entirely in silence. According to the International Maritime Organization, more than 11,000 seafarers have been effectively tracked aboard ships anchored in the Persian Gulf since the Iran war began disrupting Strait of Hormuz traffic in late February. 11,000 people, merchant sailors, tanker crews, cargo ship workers from dozens of countries, almost none of them combatants in any sense, almost none of them likely to have been asked their opinion before their voyage routed them into a war zone, have spent the better part of 4 months anchored off ports like Sultan Qaboos in Oman, unable to safely transit the strait, unable to go home, simply waiting. As mine clearing and de-escalation finally progressed enough that insurers and shipping companies started regaining confidence in the route, those ships finally began moving again. I want to sit with that number for a second, because it's the kind of human cost that gets entirely lost underneath the macro coverage of the strait reopening. Every story this month about Hormuz has been told through the lens of oil prices, inflation data, and Federal Reserve policy, and those things matter, genuinely. But 11,000 people spent 4 months of their lives parked on ships in a war zone because of a conflict between two governments, with zero say in the matter, and almost zero acknowledgement in the press that they existed at all, until this week's IMO update. That's worth naming on its own terms, not just as a footnote to an oil story. Now, the oil story, because it connects directly to a market reckoning that's been unfolding all week. Brent crude settled Wednesday at $73.74 a barrel, its lowest level since before the U.S. and Israel first launched strikes against Iran in late February. That's the headline outcome of the de-escalation working as designed. The blockade premium is coming out of the price. The seafarers are finally moving, and inflation pressure tied to the war should start easing in the data over the coming months. But at the exact same moment that piece of good news landed, global markets were busy unwinding something else entirely, a sharp, volatile reassessment of whether the AI investment boom that's driven this year's entire stock market rally is actually as solid as its valuation implies. Here's what actually happened this week, in sequence. South Korea's KOSPI index collapsed 10% and tripped a circuit breaker for the first time since March, dragging Samsung and SK Hynix down more than 12% apiece. Japan's Nikkei fell 3.6%, SoftBank sank 15%, and roughly $474 billion in global market value evaporated in a single session. By Wednesday, markets had stabilized somewhat. The Nasdaq was basically flat, the Dow actually rose, and traders shifted their attention to Micron's earnings report as a referendum on whether AI memory chip demand is real or overhyped. But underneath that stabilization, gold futures dropped below $4,000, 0.00 an ounce for the first time in 7 months. A move analysts directly tied to the broader tech sell-off, rattling even traditionally safe haven positioning. And the street's market reporting flagged something structurally important. South Korea's chip leader SK Hynix is now planning a nearly $30 billion U.S. listing, adding even more supply into an AI memory sector that's already under pressure, meaning the very companies riding this boom are racing to cash out into public markets at exactly the moment investors are starting to ask whether the boom can sustain its own weight. Senator Elizabeth Warren put the underlying tension about as plainly as anyone has this week. Speaking to CNBC on Wednesday about new Fed Chair Kevin Warsh's predicament, she said, "Donald Trump has put Kevin Warsh and the Fed in a box. That's not a throwaway partisan line. It's a precise description of an actual structural bind. Warsh was installed specifically because Trump wanted a chair who'd cut rates. Inflation, however, is still running well above target, significantly because of the same Iran war energy shock that's only now starting to unwind. If Warsh cuts rates to please the president who appointed him, he risks reigniting inflation just as the energy relief should be arriving anyway. If he holds or signals hikes, which is exactly what he did in his first press conference last week, prompting a market sell-off of its own, he validates every AI bubble fear currently rattling Seoul and Tokyo, because higher rates specifically punish exactly the kind of high growth future cash flow dependent companies that have powered this entire rally. There is no version of Warsh's next move that doesn't disappoint somebody with real money on the table. Warren's box framing isn't a gotcha. It's just accurate. What ties these two halves of the story together is this. The Iran war's resolution is genuinely materially easing one source of economic pressure. Oil prices are falling, seafarers are finally going home, inflation should moderate. But that relief is arriving at the exact moment a separate, much larger speculative structure, the AI investment boom that's been propping up nearly the entire stock market's gains this year, is getting its first serious stress test. One crisis ending doesn't mean the underlying economy is suddenly stable. It just means the next source of instability gets a clearer view. And now, because this week genuinely earned one good, uncomplicated, purely celebratory story, let's talk about something extraordinary that happened on a soccer field. On Tuesday, Cristiano Ronaldo scored twice in Portugal's 5-0 demolition of Uzbekistan, and in doing so, became the first man in the history of the World Cup to score at 6 separate tournaments: 2006, 2010, 2014, 2018, 2022, and now 2026. He's 41 years and 138 days old. His opening goal, in the 6th minute, made him the second oldest player ever to score at a World Cup, behind only Cameroon's Roger Milla in 1994. His second goal, just before halftime, made him the oldest player in men's World Cup history to record a multi-goal game, directly breaking the record Lionel Messi had set against Algeria earlier in this same tournament, and then extended again against Austria just 3 days before Ronaldo's match. Those 2 goals also pushed his career international tally to 145, putting him 23 goals ahead of Messi on the all-time list, and moved him past the legendary Eusebio to become Portugal's all-time leading World Cup scorer outright. What makes Tuesday genuinely remarkable isn't just the records, it's the context around them. There had been real public debate in Portuguese football media over whether manager Roberto Martinez bench Ronaldo after a flat performance in Portugal's tournament opener against DR Congo. Ronaldo's response wasn't a press conference. It was scoring twice in the first half against Uzbekistan and playing the full 90 minutes at an age when most professional footballers had been retired for half a decade. ESPN's stats team noted one more detail worth sitting with: the gap between Uzbekistan's 18-year-old starter Bekruz Kerimov and Ronaldo on the pitch that day, 22 years and 183 days, is the largest age gap between 2 starting players in World Cup history. A teenager and a 41-year-old sharing a field, and the 41-year-old was the best player on it. I don't have a critical angle here, and once again, I'm not going to force one. Messi and Ronaldo have spent 2 decades being measured against each other, and this week, 3 days apart, each of them did something the other hadn't. There's a real chance, with both Argentina and Portugal advancing, that they end up facing off in the knockout rounds of what's almost certainly the final World Cup either man will ever play. That's not a story that needs a counterpoint. It just needs to be watched. 3 stories today. A prime minister's 2-year tenure collapsed in 72 hours over immigration and energy, while the president of the United States couldn't resist publicly grading the wreckage before the man had even finished his resignation speech. 11,000 sailors, who never asked to be part of anyone's war, are finally sailing home at the exact moment markets are discovering that a different, much larger bet on AI's ability to justify its own valuation might be just as fragile as the geopolitics everyone's been distracted by all year. And 2 of the greatest players to ever live spent 1 week, 3 days apart, rewriting the same record book at ages when careers are supposed to be over. The thread connecting the first 2 stories is the same one I keep coming back to. Crises end, but they end into other crises, not into stability. The thread connecting the third story to the other 2 is simpler. Sometimes, the most reliable thing in the news cycle is 2 men who've spent 20 years proving that getting older doesn't have to mean getting smaller.